Monday, everybody. Today we will speak about food perception. First of all, as always, I apologize for my English because I'm not English mother tongue, so I hope you can understand anyway what I would like to say. Okay, food perception. First of all, depending on how one perceives foodstuff and nourishment, will also affect food ethics. There is a professor named Frankie that says the idea that the adoption of the right diet has beneficial effects and ensure longevity is common in many cultural contexts, and it is emphasized by the Oriental medicine, for example, Ayurvedic medicine, which makes of nutrition a healing strategy. We have to underline the term used, right, that this adjective already suggests an ethical approach. So, for this Ayurvedic medicine, food is able to bring well-being, balance, harmony, contributing at the overall equilibrium of body and mind. According to Ayurvedic medicine, foodstuffs influences the nature of who absorbs it. But in many other cultures, humans are assimilated to the qualities attributed to the food. Fraser, in 1973, in his brilliant ethnographic research, brings many examples of people who avoid to eat animals to advert at assuming the features. We know, however, that things are not in that way. It is clear that if a cat eats a mouse, there isn't necessarily a contamination of the meat. Many other factors have to be considered. The feeding stuff, having whatever origin, is metabolized and no trace remains in the animal that has eaten it unless there were form of disease, infection, or chemical contamination that anyway, in most of the cases, are extinguished in the digestive process and by the immune system. So there is a misperception also in food when one believes to become what one eats. We don't become pigs if we eat pigs, and we don't become maize corn if we eat maize corn. However, due to a particular perception of foodstuff, there can be the onset of unjustified anxieties and fears that influence ethics and consequently the consumption of the people. So the consumer changes the ways of consumption. Again, Frankie, the professor Frankie, says, since the time of Pythagoras, who considered deplorable the bloodshed because of the pain of killed animals, would contaminate the meat, eating meat result as a fierce and ruthless act. So we can say that the ethical choice of Pythagoras derives by the impression that one feels watching animals suffering and in concurring bloodshed. So the term impression is so important. It's really important to understand everything because the impressions are created from the inputs that are elaborated in our brains, and so we have these impressions that are in some extent exaggerated respect to the real action that has happened. The intuition of Pythagoras is very interesting because now it has been scientifically proven that an animal sent for slaughter, if ill treated, its body undergoes a series of chemical and biological reactions and releases in the blood substances that will affect the quality of meat. I want to point out now only that animals subjected to stress and ill treatment have a reduction of the quantity of glycogen in the muscles, resulting in high pH in meat in post-mortem, which make them, these meats, more attackable from microorganisms. But it is perhaps more important to recall that there is a release of hormones that spoils the sensorial quality of the meat. The point of view of Pythagoras reveals the blending between the creation of personal ethics and the quality of meat in a historical period when there weren't the present day techniques in chemical biological analysis, but there were certainly bloody alike slaughter techniques and less hygiene practices in slaughtering. More generally, we can say that the quality of food and their organoleptic characteristics like color, smell, taste, texture affect our agricultural and food ethics. Perhaps Pythagoras had the type of food ethics because as that type of food ethics because of the impression when he saw the slaughter of animals combined with the hot flavors derived from the microbiological attack and the release of hormones in the meats, and maybe some belly ache made the rest. We know, however, that the result of a careless and cruel slaughter, even if it gives us a lower quality meat, noticeable also from the organoleptic point of view, it doesn't give an unsafe food, not necessarily. Alongside, it may be interesting to consider that also the animal species, except for rare cases, have evolved without developing form of defense that prevent predators consume their meat because poisoned. Therefore, we can deduce that the various categorization of food as good, bad, allowed, not allowed, healthy, unhealthy, right and wrong mingle with impressions, prejudices, and perceptions to create ethical principles that influence consumption and dietary choices. But is the culture itself and the society that shape food ethics. For example, the classic mother sentence phrase, eat everything you have on your plate and think of the children who die of hunger, creates in the mind of the children a sense of guilty, doubts, provokes the creation of a thought that otherwise there can be developed in a so young mind, in a so young brain. This is a normal doubt. This is a normal education strategy given that the children are too young to have a direct experience of problems related to food waste and malnutrition, and their inability to rationalize and to think about these problems creates the need for the parents to give a code of behavior, a code of ethics, in other words, about the food that costs money and should not be wasted. At the same time, and in the same way, the media campaigns of the Western world treat as children the consumers creating fictitious realities or showing strong images to direct their choices. We can detect again violence, social violence in this way of advertising. In adulthood, undergoing this type of influence and cultivating an empathic thought oriented in the proposed direction, not self determined, as a consequence, almost a reduction of personal freedom. So, this type of violence create a reduction in personal freedom of the consumers who undergoes this type of advertising. So is a form of violence. It is a fact that in our society there is always someone who tries to induce an empathic attitude in favor of those who have less, and this is expressed in various forms and different purposes. Metham, this professor, notes that an instinctive reaction to crisis in LDC, low developed countries, such as outbreaks of famine, is that we ought to play our part as individuals by making donation to charity or becoming involved in fundraising event. This statement is misleading from different point of view. I don't agree completely. I don't agree at all with this professor. First of all, not necessarily ethic realizes in this way. I say the proposed scenario is poor because, aware of a food crisis in a distant country, other people may reduce their ethics discomfort, for example, through prayer, not necessarily giving money. So, it can be, for example, prayer, to name just one of the possibilities and not, therefore, giving money. Secondly, we have to consider that this modality of charity isn't a process that enables for the emancipation of the beneficiaries. In fact, we should ask to ourselves if it is ethical while natural resources are taken from underdeveloped countries, grant some soap to plundered population when the situation becomes difficult to manage is a solution. It is clear that in this perspective, the acts of charity appear to have a completely different function than that the one stated. The main functions and purposes of these actions can be grouped into three categories. The first one, let me give me a moment. Okay. First one, cleaning the consciences of the exploiters. Secondly, calm the minds of the subjects, of the people exploited. And third, maintain conveniently the situation of exploitation. So, in last analysis, it is interesting to see that many of the economic contributions intended for charity activities are required in that segment of the rich world population that is subjugated in the exploitation production mechanism, unleash cunningly ethical feelings of guilty of the middle low classes of population in developed countries. Alternatively, another subtle form of charity is that of those who, after having gained disproportionately on the back of unaware population, push oneself forward with donations that in relation to their wealth are only few coins. we can see now, we can speak about Bill Gates, for example. In order to continue the analysis of the case related to charity, specifically to food charity, it is worth reflecting on the text on a text that introduces another way to mask business operation in the form of aid. Professor Lang says, by the 1980s, developing countries argue that rich country subsidies were unfair and that they acted as barriers to entry and led to surpluses being dumped on them, undercutting their production, thereby giving wealth to traders via export refunds and processors via cheap food ingredients. This is what Professor Lang said. Now we can consider another passage in which Professor Metham, brings his ethics and Hamlet-like doubts on this topic. Food aid and trade are two, at first sight contrasting, strategies for assisting LDC. Trade, being a largely self-serving activity, might appear to be less virtuous than aid, which sounds altruistic. But, as economist John Marsh points out, the distinction is not always so clear-cut. When DC government, so developed country governments, dump food on LDC, calling it aid, it is in reality simply a means of disposing of their food surpluses, which by undermining the efforts of LDC farmers to make a living may do more harm than good. In some cases, food aid might lead to dependency with LDC governments having a little incentive to invest in agriculture if food is being provided for free. On the other hand, trade might stimulate economic activity in LDC and have far-reaching benefits for sustainable development. However, there are clearly some situations, such as famine conditions, when providing food aid is a moral obligation. Neither trade nor aid should be dismissed out of hand, for both would seem to have roles to play. We can infer, so now I speak, we can infer from the text above that having put ethic and moral assumption wrong, or at least having them misunderstood, there is the risk to lose our bearings if we have to decide on provide or not aid in an area that has problem of malnutrition. In fact, the analyses that come out are contradictory. In fact, we can understand from this text that one say one thing, one say another, and both say another thing again. Defining a moral obligation, the food help, in case of famine, can be shared only in a situation in which one cannot support the sight of or the thought of someone who is suffering. This is my point of view, clearly. In this field, there are not absolute indications. It could be the social morality, too, that presses ourselves to give, even if our personal ethics would be more cautious. But famines there have always been and always will be, regardless ethics and morality. And the lives of farmers in the underdeveloped countries, it will be difficult regardless the morality of the Western world, that in reality does its own interests. And this is the key to understand if it is right or not to provide humanitarian aids. On the one hand, these ensure the interest of the market, which gains without regard for anyone or anything. And on the other hand, there are those who cannot withstand with a view of exploitation and the poverty of other peoples. It will find a balance between aid and market on the basis of morality and ethics of the various agents in the system. So it is clear that there is not a unique solution at any way. There will be ever the tension between the different actors with their different interests. In other words, going to a hand. In other words, what moves man in is self-interest, but he has a brain programmed to preserve also the others, the altruism. Intended as a human being similar to him, and on this basis, the equilibrium of a society that is equitable only in appearance is structured because it does revamping and actions designed to generate a collective perception of fairness. Well, we arrived at the end of this first part. The second part will arrive soon, even though I doubt that someone will watch these videos. So bye for now, mandi a tutti, mandi to everybody.